Hello, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining me for what should be a very interesting discussion where we're looking at this ongoing question about embalmers clots. Now, I'm calling them embalmers clots because that's where it came from. Embalmers were noticed kind of abnormal pattern. They raised awareness of it. They were largely ignored. It then get caught up in a narrative, and it's 2024, and they're still seeing it. Now, for me personally, I feel as though I have a responsibility to continue to talk about this. And the reason I feel that responsibility is not only did I speak to the embalmers and see some of the clots, but I had a whistleblower reach out to me, and I'll play a couple of clips as we go along in this interview, who was saying that he was seeing this in the living. Now, that shocked me because at that time I had only thought this was occurring post mortem. And then I realized that we really need to get to the bottom of this. So, everything I do here is part of that responsibility that I feel that someone had opened up risked their career just to come and talk about this. And therefore, I have to try my best to make sure that this is addressed properly. So let's add in our two guests. We have Richard and we have Tom. And I'll start off with you, Richard. I'll just ask you to do a quick introduction for yourself, and then we will get into. Then I'll ask Tom. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Richard Hirschman. I've been an embalmer. I started my career as an apprentice back in 2001, and I've been in this field for it's getting on 23 years now. So I've been a self-employed trade embalmer since 2015. So I have lots of experience in the embalming room. I'm very familiar with the process, and I think that pretty much sums it up.
Excellent, excellent. And Tom,
Yes, Dr. Haviland, thanks for having me on the show. I'm a retired U.S. Air Force major, spent 36 years in and with the United States Air Force in uniform as a defense contractor, electrical engineer, also a data analyst. And I got involved in all this after watching that movie Died Suddenly that Richard and about 6 or 7 other embalmers were in, saying that they were seeing some unusual clotting going on in their corpses.
excellent, excellent. So I think this is probably a good place to start because, Richard, I must admit that at the time, because you were one of the people featured in this program, Died Suddenly, and it became a little bit of an anti-vax narrative. It therefore got ignored largely by the mainstream. Scientists didn't want to hear about it. And I think that this just then got completely lost. So let's just see if we can wipe the slate clean here. Tell me, how in the world did this end up being some kind of documentary? Where did it all start from?
That's a pretty big history. In 2021, I started noticing these unusual clots, and it was relatively early. I would estimate in the spring, somewhere between March, April, May, definitely no later than June. We did notice an increase in clotting right away in or earlier on, like let me see, in as COVID itself, prior to the vaccine was going on, I started noticing an increase in typical blood clotting issues. And we didn't know what to, think of it, but they were typical red jelly clots that we're somewhat used to seeing, but they were getting, they were just more of them. But it was in early spring of 2021, this unusual clotting. As the summer and fall was going around, I'm talking with other embalmers and people that I work with, asking them if they seen this. Some of them that aren't in the embalming room at the time, I started showing them pictures. Nobody had ever really seen anything like it. Everybody was the embalmers were starting to see these themselves. People were asking how often I was seeing it. I started in November, starting to document on my computer the frequency in which I was seeing this. I was asked told by others that I'm working with, hey, somebody needs to get this out there, reach out to some of these organizations. I reached out to one of them. I won't mention their name. And they actually responded to me. And it wasn't really going anywhere. I sent them photographs of what I was seeing. And then in January of 2022, there just so happened to be another person who was the DoD whistleblower talking about the DMED data. Her name is Dr. Teresa Long. And she happened to be at a funeral at one of the funeral homes that I do work for. And her and the funeral director were discussing some of the strange things that have been going on since early on. And the funeral director said, you need to speak to our embalmer. And he put me in contact with her. I shared with her some of the images. She was highly alarmed. It was answering, maybe this is one of the reasons why they're seeing some strange things in the soldiers. And she was the one that put me into, or actually gave my information to Dr. Jane Ruby, who, I understand is somewhat of a, what do you call a alternative news media type person. But she was the one that was actually willing to sit down and look at this and interview me and actually put this into the public eye.
I'm going to pause you there a minute, Richard. This is important, and I thought this needed to be set out, because one of the problems that I find, and this is what we need to address, is that science, it seems, and medicine has lost their curiosity. It's kind of like, if somebody sees something strange, why wouldn't you want to know? If a gardener is saying, say, for instance, I hear people talking about if there's a tree close to, say, a 5G thing, and half of the tree is dead and the other half is okay. I've never seen anything like that. You'd want to know, well, is there a reason for it? That's just science. That's just the basics of science. And I can't understand when people, if this is a real observation, and as you said, this seemed as though it wasn't just you, why would anyone discount it? Even if they don't understand it, why would they discount it? So I'm going to bring in Tom here a minute. We'll come back to you in a minute, in a short while, Richard. But Tom, you then got involved in this process, and just very quickly remind people what made you have nothing to do with the embalming industry. You're ex-military, you're relaxing. What in the world made you get involved in this?
Well, I watched that movie Died Suddenly the night that it premiered. It was Monday of the week of Thanksgiving here in the United States in November of 2022. And I actually, was shocked by the film because I saw a lot of the footage in the film that showed people like Richard removing clots from corpses. But what really got my attention was at the 13-minute and 15-second mark in that movie, an amazing statement was made. An embalmer from the state of Indiana, Mr. Wallace Hooker, was lecturing at an Ohio Embalmers Association conference in Columbus, Ohio on the 26th of October in 2022. And he was speaking to a room of about 100 embalmers. And he showed them photographs of the white fibrous clots that he'd been removing from his corpses over the last year or so. And he asked that room of embalmers, by a show of hands, how many of you are seeing these same white fibrous clots? And he says in the film that almost the entire room of 100 embalmers raised their hands. Yes, they were. He then asked them, well, when did you start seeing these clots? And they all agreed it was in the middle of 2021, about the same time Richard said that he saw them. So I thought whatever else went on in that movie, that was an amazing statement, right? Either that's true or false. Either those embalmers raised their hands or they didn't. So I got up the very next day, Tuesday of that week of Thanksgiving of 2022, and I said to myself, I don't think any reporter is going to chase after this story. So I decided myself to call the Ohio Embalmers Association. They're located in Cincinnati, Ohio, about an hour south of where I live in Dayton. And I talked to their president, Mr. Dan Becker, their vice president, Mr. Woody Wilson, and their secretary, Mr. David Hicks. I asked all three of the gentlemen, did you happen to be in the room at the time that those 100 embalmers supposedly raised their hands saying they're seeing these clots too. Well, none of the three gentlemen happened to be in the room at the time. However, the vice president, Mr. Woody Wilson, who runs his own funeral home up in Marysville, Ohio, about an hour north of where I live, and he does his own embalming. A lot of funeral directors do their own embalming. Woody told me, Tom, I'm seeing the white fibrous clots too. So now I said, hey, I have an official officer from the Ohio Embalmers Association corroborating what these 6 or 7 embalmers in this Died Suddenly film said they're seeing. So I said, this is a big deal, right? And actually now Woody is now the president of the Ohio Embalmers Association. So right there and then I decided that I needed to do a survey, a nationwide survey in the U.S. that I later then turned into a worldwide survey to see just how prevalent these white fibrous clots were. So that led me to the creation of my 2 worldwide embalmer blood clot surveys.
Excellent. Good. So I've got the basis here. What I'm going to ask you to do for me, Richard, is I want you just to quickly explain to people, because they'll hear about embalming and they don't quite know what it means and why this question of a clot is even relevant to you. Just very quickly, what is it that you do?
Well, we're trying to preserve the body for the families to be able to have a public viewing. And in order to do that, to slow down the decomposition process, we inject into the body a formaldehyde, a chemical preservative. It has dyes and all these other little things that go along with it to try to make the body look more natural. And the way we do that is we typically would raise one artery and one vein. And usually they're the large ones. Either it's going to be around the carotid, or it's going to be around the iliac femoral region, or potentially the axillaries. But we raise the artery in order to inject the fluid with the chemical solution. And we have to open up the vein in order to allow that excess fluid to drain out, to kind of flush out the vascular system, replacing the majority of the blood with this preservative that helps prevent the body from decomposing. Does that sound pretty fair?
Yeah. And so in the process then, so this just so that people will understand why the clots are relevant to you.
Yes.
You started to have problems with the process and the speed of doing it. What exactly impact would this have?
Right. As we're pushing fluid through, sometimes it has always happened, but every once in a while, we would let's say there was the left arm is not getting the fluid, and we can tell by the color and the feel of the skin, we can tell there's no fluid getting there. So in order to embalm that arm, we have to raise an additional artery and vein in that arm in order to push that fluid through. Typically, what would block the fluid from flowing are clots. And even the typical grape jelly clots can cause issues, and it always has off and on in our history. But these clots that we're seeing are so massive in size, it's blocking a lot of the different parts of the body. Let's say, if there's some major clot on one side of the neck, this side of the head won't get the fluid. So then we're having to take extra time to go in, make an additional incision in order to shoot that fluid, or to try to shoot that fluid up in that specific area to try to help clear it out. Now, these clots that are really weird and strange, which is another alarming thing for me, is typically we would never see clots in the artery. I'm not saying it could never happen, but it was hardly ever that you would ever see it. But I'm finding these strange white fibrous clots in the artery. And the only way I find them in the artery, of course, is when I make the incision. I will see it right there. In the veins, I can also see clots when I open up the vein. But when we're pumping the fluid, remember that fluid is forcing in the artery, and it goes through the body, and it then flushes out the vein. So the majority of the clots that we see do come out of the venous side. But if there's clots in the arterial side, those are too big to go through the capillaries. Therefore, they get bunched up and stuck, and slows down the process of embalming, which makes our job a little bit more difficult, sometimes almost impossible.
This is very important. So this is why I needed to take the time for you to go through that, because so people understand what exactly the implications are. So it's not just simply that you notice a few clots. It actually is impacting your work. It's making you take a longer time to do a process that you're still being paid the same amount for. So it actually has a relevance even to your business and the way how the business operates.
Yes, Dr. McMillan, I just thought of using this as an example. Look at the plumbing in your house. The pressure side, where you're getting your fresh water, has pressure behind it. You open it up and you get water in your sink, correct?
Yeah.
That's like the arterial side. You don't hardly get a clog in your water line going into the house. You get your clogs on like the venous side, the slower side, the drain. The drain is what gets clogged. The sewage line, where the fluid is not under a lot of pressure, it just kind of flows out. We're seeing these strange clots on both sides of this. It's almost like it's on the high pressure side. And I'm guessing that's why clots were not as frequent to be found in the arterial side, because of the pressure.
Yeah, this is important stuff. Good. I'm glad to hear that. Now, just to clarify something for the listeners, when I first heard about this, I remember having the discussion that we were not seeing this in the context of living people. So this was clearly a mechanism that was happening post-mortem. And at that time, the only thing that made sense to me were what we call cryoglobulins, where these antibodies could be in the bloodstream, and then when the blood cools, it then forms these kind of unusual clots. And that was the thinking I had at the time. However, and I'm going to play you a short clip before we go on, is that I had a whistleblower reach out to me because he clearly saw me thinking that. And the whistleblower was saying to me, this is not just happening after people have died. This is happening in the living. So I'm going to play you a short clip of this, and then we'll come back with our discussion. But this was from a previous interview with the whistleblower, who remained anonymous because it was relevant to his work, but really important information that he shared. Listen to what he had to say at the time.
A big increase on our numbers when it comes to saddle PE. We used to maybe get one every couple of months. Now we're getting a couple every week.
Wow.
Philip, have they noticed a difference in the consistency of the clot itself? That it's less, it's not as friable as a traditional clot. Does it have the elasticity of the things that we're seeing with the embalmers? Washing off to a white consistency.
That's
those
a
kind
good.
of things.
So recently, just only last week, we pulled out one of these clots, and I tried with all my force in front of the room. Everyone was kind of looking. I tried with a good amount of force to pull it apart, and I could not.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So here's
And
another.
I
Go
think
ahead,
as well,
Tucker.
from experience from the cath lab, have you seen anything like this before?
No, sir.
Was there a point at which you started to notice this? Because it's typically, I would say, unusual.
As we go back on the pictures, we thought it was something that was just a fluke, something that just would go away. So no one really paid too much attention to it. This was in 2021. In 2022, as we started to increase on our numbers, we then started to question at that point the changes, the pathology. Even, like I said, these vascular surgeons are in the field for 30, 40 years. And for them to look across the room and look at the clot that they just pulled out and to ask the room, what is that? We started then to notice there was something wrong.
I'm going to pause there. Yeah. So no, this is a very important question. No, I need you to say something here, Tom, because a lot of people keep on saying, well, if this was relevant and if this was happening, in the living, we would be hearing about it and people would be talking about it and sharing it. What has your experience been like in terms of people speaking about this?
Well, same experience you've been having, Dr. McMillan. People are pretty tight-lipped about it. I have found my own cath lab whistleblower here in the United States as well. He's a cardiologist and endovascular specialist who works in Jacksonville, Florida. I will not name his name, but he has sent me photographs and angiograms of white fibrous clots that he's been removing from living people for the last 3 years. He's afraid to come out and speak about it, though. He's afraid of having his board certification taken away, his license taken away, his career destroyed. And so he's afraid to talk about it. But it is happening in the living. And I know that in your interview with your whistleblower, he went on to say that he was pulling anywhere from 3 to 10 of these white fibrous clots out of his patients a week in his one cath lab alone. So this is a very serious thing we're talking about. It's happening in the living as well as in the dead. And it was really not a surprise to the embalmers. Richard can tell you, the embalmers were picking up bodies that were only an hour or two old, and they were finding them riddled with the clots. So they were convinced they were performing pre-death as well as possibly post-death as well. So this is not a surprise, but it's a shocking thing, and it's something that the community needs to address. And unfortunately, like you say, they're afraid to talk about it. In fact, a couple months ago, I actually tried to run a separate survey for vascular surgeons and cath lab workers, and I sent it to the vascular surgeon societies. Or the one here in the United States, the National Society, is located in Rosemont, Illinois, and they have over 6,300 members. I asked them to please take a survey very similar to my embalmer blood clot surveys, and they refused to do so. They refused to forward it to their 6,300 members of their organizations. The UK, Australia, and New Zealand and Canada societies for vascular surgery didn't even bother to respond to my request. And I'm sure they did not forward it either, because my SurveyMonkey collectors have only 1 or 2 responses in them from the vascular surgeon cath lab worker survey that I set up a couple months ago. So they're very tight-lipped about it. It's unfortunate.
So let me just think about something here a second, Richard. What are the chances? Because Tom has done this, and he says like 30% of embalmers are seeing this. So it means 70% of embalmers are saying they are not seeing this.
No, that's not quite right, Dr. McMillan. In the last 2 surveys, 70% of the embalmers say they are seeing the white fibrous clots.
70%. What about the 30% who are not? Richard, is that possible?
Absolutely. I was speaking with a gentleman several months ago who said, here in the state of Alabama, there's some 900 embalmers. And he said, of the 900 something embalmers, maybe a third of the embalmers are actually embalming. So there are people that are in my industry. I'm a funeral director and embalmer, but my passion is taking care of the deceased and restoration. And so I focus on that. A lot of people in my field are licensed funeral directors and embalmers, but they move up in ranks. And they then move on into positions in the funeral home that pulls them out of the embalming room. And though they're licensed embalmers, they're not actually doing the work. If that person were to fill out the survey that Tom sent, and they haven't embalmed a body in 10 years, they're going to say they've never seen him. And when they do the survey, all we can do is hope that their integrity is intact. You have some people that are strongly being political on this and are wanting to kind of thwart the idea, or to kind of stick with what you started off in the beginning, throw this off as some mere conspiracy theory. But it is true that there are embalmers. I spoke to an embalmer from Florida yesterday and asked if this individual would be willing to speak. And the answer was, if they were told by their employer that if they were seen speaking out on this, they would be fired. Now, why would that be?
Yeah. So what you had interacted with the British Association of Embalmers, Tom. What
Correct.
was it that they said with regards to doing a survey? So literally all you're asking is just a simple 10-question survey with regards to these clots. What was their response to you?
Yeah, and it's good to note that the survey itself is as unbiased as possible. To no point in either the survey instructions nor the survey questions do I ever mention the words COVID or COVID vaccine. Remember, I'm only asking the embalmers, what are you seeing? When did you see it? And how much are you seeing? What percentage of your corpses are you seeing these blood clotting phenomenon? And I had done a YouTube video with Dr. John Campbell in your country back in February. And that particular video got, I think, close to 2 million views and about 27,000 comments to it. One of the comments was made by the National General Secretary of the British Institute of Embalmers, which was interesting. And in that comment, that person admitted that they had not distributed my survey to their embalmer members to take for the organization. So I said to myself, maybe I should give them another chance to take it. So on the 29th of June, I sent an email with a link to a special survey that I had my assistant, Ms. Laura Kasner, develop just for the BIE to take during the month of July of this year. And I asked, I said, hey, here's a second opportunity for your embalmers to take this survey. Would you please do so? And I received a response from the BIE on the 8th of July, which was fairly interesting, which declined to participate in the survey and gave me a few reasons as to why they were declining to participate in my survey.
Yeah, so it seems as though this is the problem, is that I think that there is still an association that this is trying to question the vaccines, the COVID vaccines. Now, in truth, it has to be part of the question, but I think that people need to separate, because this could be just related to COVID itself, an infection. It is possible that it is not connected. But here's a practical question for you, Richard. Because at the moment, there isn't necessarily the same amount of uptake of booster vaccines. Have you noticed any trend with regards to the white fibrous clots that you notice?
The trend with the white fibrous clots does sometimes seem to go up and down. Overall, in the big picture, though, I'm still seeing the white fibrous clots in probably close to 50% of the corpses I'm embalming.
And when you say there's a difference between small clots, say, I mean, a few white fibrous clots and a lot of clots. If you were to differentiate based on that, the people who had a lot of big clots, what kind of numbers would that be?
I haven't really broke it down. The way that I notated in my computer is on a color code, and I haven't differentiated those that have the really large white clots as opposed to some of the smaller ones. They either have them or they don't. I do have a different category that I have in yellow that is cautionary. And a lot of times, even if I see just a little bit of the white fibrous stuff, I will lean on the caution side and not label it in the orange with the white fibrous clots. I'll leave it more on the side of the smaller clots in the yellow. So I'm trying to be conservative on my numbers. The really large clots, though, they are if I'm guessing, and I'm trying to go back on recollection, I would probably say of my orange categories, the much larger, more obvious in your face, larger clots are probably half of those that are in my orange category.
So probably about 25%. And have you seen any recently? And do you have any examples?
Oh, absolutely. I have several of these on my desk. And of course, there was a time I had almost quit collecting some of these samples. These are just different samples. So
And these were taken out of arteries, not veins.
they're both arteries and veins.
Wow. And the difference, if you had collected a normal clot and put it in that formalin, what would it look like?
Typically, it would look like if you could get a piece of grape jelly to not dissolve in anything, it would look like that. It would look like a chunk of grape jelly. It would be very, very dark purple, almost black.
Wow. Yeah, so
You
so this is the difference here, is that you then collected the hard evidence, the examples of it, and then when people actually see it, it's very difficult to discount what you have seen, as opposed to somebody saying, I'm seeing more clots. But when you actually see those clots, do you mind if you just bring one up again so that we can see it?
I got one here that's sitting by itself, so you can really see. Hopefully you can see that.
Yeah.
This is just the clot. It's just one clot by itself.
Wow.
And I believe that
file too from Richard that he gave to me as well.
Yeah.
That came out of one corpse. Dr. McMillan, one of the reasons that we did the survey, and the reason the survey is why it's important is we can glean some really good information out of the questions we've been asking. And from the first two surveys we've done, we've been able to glean, for example, in our first survey, we asked the embalmers, when did you first start seeing these white fibrous clots? And it was interesting that some of the embalmers, a smaller percentage, said they did see them in 2020, which is, as you know, is the year that we had the virus, but we did not have the vaccines yet. So that's an indication to me that the COVID virus itself could be at least one of the causes for these white fibrous clots. But what was interesting in that first survey is then there was an explosion of the number of embalmers that were seeing the white fibrous clots starting in the year 2021 moving forward. Also, one of the things we wanted to check for is prevalence, as you said, and you asked Richard earlier, what percentage of his corpses are we seeing the clots in? And what was interesting about that is in our first survey that we ran for the year 2022, for that entire year, the embalmers were seeing these white fibrous clots in an average of 30% of their corpses. And that included all the embalmers that said they saw in none of the corpses. So if you even include all those zeros where embalmers said they saw no clots, you still had an average of 30% of corpses containing these white fibrous clots in the year 2022. What's interesting is when we ran the survey this last year for 2023, the embalmer said they were seeing it when you averaged it all together. It was only 20% of the corpses contain these white fibrous clots. So that's an indication to me that it looks like the problem is starting to subside a little bit. But then you have to start to think about what the meaning of that is in terms of the elephant in the room. As you know, most American adults over the age of 18 here in the United States, 80% got the elephant in the room in the year 2021, the first year that it came out. Only 20% of American adults over the age of 18 took the bivalent Omicron booster in the fall of 2022. And then only about 10 to 15% of American adults over the age of 18 took the XBB 1.5 booster when it came out in the fall of 2023. So I'm not saying that is. But if the elephant in the room is contributing to the white fibrous clots, you might expect the percentage of them in corpses to go down as you get further and further away from most people having taken their elephant in the room back in 2021. And as you know, this is an indication of the Bradford-Hill criteria for what's called reversibility. If you take the cause away, does the effect go away? So I can't say for sure that's what's happening because, correlation is not necessarily causation, but it does bring some evidence to bear from the survey. So that's why we try to collect this kind of information. We believe it's important, whether it's implicating the elephant in the room or COVID itself or the combination of the two. It's important that we gather information to try to track the existence of the clots. Like I said, 70% of the embalmers said they're seeing them. the prevalence of the clots, whether it's in 30% of their corpses in 2022, now 20% in 2023, and then the timing, when they saw this all happening. So, and then I don't know if you want to talk about it for a minute, but there's also a couple other phenomena that Richard and his fellow embalmers are seeing, and that's microclotting. And on our last survey, the embalmers, about 80% of the embalmers said they were seeing microclotting in an average of 1 out of every 4 corpses, 25% of their corpses. And this is a phenomenon, the embalmers call it dirty blood, or also coffee grounds. And they said this is something you used to see very rarely in corpses. I don't know if, Richard, you want to comment on that or not?
Yeah, that's an important point. I remember hearing something about it. Tell us a little bit more what that means, Richard.
Well, it's just an observational thing. In our field, we never classified clotting at all. We never looked at it, but we can see there's a difference. And what Tom is talking about, and I'm getting this from other embalmers as well, they're seeing the same thing, is that the blood is just blood. When you're flushing the fluid out, it comes out very dark red, typically red, and it just mixes with the water and goes down the sewage. But this dirty blood, this sandy blood, it's just another indication, something we're seeing, that the blood looks different. It's not the same as it used to be. And this sandy blood, it looks sometimes, and I had one of these cases just yesterday. It looks like there's little fine grains of sand mixed in with the blood as it is coming out of the body, which is unusual. The other thing is the coffee ground size is a little bit larger, like all these little chunks of blood. Instead of your typical red jelly looking clot, these clots are weird shapes. They're seem to be a little bit heavier. Some of them are more elastic, and some of these are longer. They become long. Instead of a typical red blood clot that might be long because it formed in the vein, when you try to pick up a typical blood clot, it falls apart in your hand. These, you can literally pick them up and stretch them, and they not necessarily fall apart right away. Now, I'm not saying you put enough pressure on them, eventually they'll break. But these clots are just different. It's just an observational thing. The reason why it doesn't get as much attention is because, people don't understand what normal blood looks like typically in the embalming process. So it's not something that you can just point your finger at and saying, "Hey, this is not normal." But it is, for us seasoned morticians that have been doing this for a long time, we can see that this blood does not look like the blood that we were used to seeing prior to 2021.
These are important. This is what I'm saying, and I try and encourage people to do this. So there may be some people who are listening, and they have a specific idea or ideology about the way how research is done. And so they may criticize your research, Tom, as not being robust enough. But the point is that I can't think of a good reason where observation, and the thing is that what you are observing, Richard, is not something that we can see from a clinical point of view. It is specific to the kind of work that you're doing. It could even be that these clots are formed because of the formalin, but this is happening because of the blend that never happened before. We don't quite know. But what people need to be aware of is that there are people across the world who are taking these clots and trying to analyze the protein structure of them and trying to break down exactly what is in them and what does it mean. I think the saddest part is that these people who are doing this are doing their best to do this quietly. They will not come forward and say what they're doing because they recognize that if they were to come forward, they could become targeted as well because it's inconvenient science. I find that to be the saddest thing with regards to what you're saying. There doesn't seem to be a desire to understand. People just want to move on. The problem is that you started seeing more of it in 2021. This is now 2024, and it is not going away. So maybe there was a hope that it would just disappear and it would have just been one of those fluke things, but it hasn't gone away. It may be relevant, may be clinically relevant, and we need to get some answers from it. So imagine, Tom, that I gave you access to whoever is in power, and they say, "Listen, Tom, I want you to get everything you can." What would you want? What would you need to help to further this process?
Well, I would get a team of people from the CDC, the FDA, the NHS, and the MHRA in your country, the TGA in Australia, and I would have them stand behind and basically insist that embalmers, funeral directors, take probably a much more detailed survey than the one that I've done, and have them complete that. Also, as we talked about earlier, send that out to vascular surgeons, endovascular specialists, other people that work in cath labs, because we think this phenomenon is happening. In fact, we know the phenomenon is happening in the living as well, and have them do a serious survey amongst the entire world to see just how prevalent this is. I think they'll find that my survey data is probably pretty accurate, that they're going to find that this is quite prevalent, these white fibrous clots are, and then get down to the business of really tackling how or why the clots are forming. As Richard and there's some teams of scientists that are already working on that issue, trying to answer that question, as you said, quietly. But we need to get those that are in authority, like I said, those organizations that I mentioned, to actually participate. And that's why I did the survey. I'm a retired Air Force guy. I really shouldn't have to do this, but I took it upon myself because I didn't see the FDA, CDC, NHS, MHRA, TGA stepping forward and doing this kind of a survey. So somebody's got to gather the information and say there's Houston, we have a problem here. And that's exactly what I did. When I had both surveys completed, I immediately notified the FDA, CDC, and NIH in this latest survey. I completed my survey on the 8th of January, sent it off the very next day, the 9th of January. Last year, I actually asked to speak at a meeting. The FDA had a meeting of its Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee back on the 26th of January of 2023. I asked to speak at that meeting and present the USA portion of my results of my first survey. Was not given that opportunity, but I did submit to them a written synopsis of the survey and what it had discovered. And I did get a tracking number from the FDA, Dr. McMillan, but throughout the entire year last year, I was never contacted once by the FDA or CDC. And this year, same thing. Nope, just crickets, nothing.
I think that one of the questions that I had asked the whistleblower, and I think when I reflect on what I hope will happen from this kind of conversation, is that based on everything that we have been seeing, there are people across the world who are observing similar patterns. It clearly isn't everybody, but for the people who are observing it and who are concerned about it, we desperately need them to talk about it. The problem is that I think everybody knows that the first people to speak about this are going to get shot down. It's like sticking your head up above the parapet. They're going to get shot at. And nobody wants that to happen. And we almost need to have a moratorium where we can have the medical and scientific community coming forward and saying, listen, okay, we have noticed this as well. We don't quite know. Let's get samples. That's the kind of thinking that needs to happen. We don't need people to almost be willing to sacrifice their careers. And I just want you guys to listen again to what the whistleblower said when I was asking him a few questions at the start. Just listen to what he had to say. Trying to understand, are you the only person who notices this?
No, sir. I have my colleagues. We have about 20 on staff, nurses, anesthesiologists, vascular surgeons, radiologists, and cardiologists have all witnessed this.
And so, what is the general response? Are people just surprised, but this is not relevant? What do you observe?
My position is to work hand in hand with the physicians. So I'm physically there, pulling them out of the patients. And I hear from time to time a physician will ask the room, what is that? Sort of shocked. We've had physicians send them to pathology. But from that point on, that is physician to physician record. And we don't hear what happens after that.
Now, somebody could quite easily say, well, you know what, this is just anecdotal observations. Maybe you are sensitive to noticing this more. Maybe you are against stuff in the pandemic. Is this really that obvious, you think?
The clots themselves have changed, and anyone in my position, any other person that does the same type of work should recognize the difference.
Would you consider yourself to be hypersensitive to looking out for complications around the pandemic and the COVID vaccine?
I didn't have to be. It was plain and clear, the changes that were happening with the blood, both arterial and venous.
Well, this is quite significant. Now, you've therefore been seeing this for some time. Have you escalated that within the hospital to either management or any other whistleblowing mechanism? Any thoughts about what you would do around that?
When I was threatened, in a sense, to go get the vaccine, and if I did not, that has an effect on you. It hung over my head for about a year. I actually thought I was 100% going to lose my job. When that happens to you and they threaten that, and they threaten your livelihood to take a license even away, it changes the way that you will speak about anything in that environment. So I chose to just not say anything. But my conscience, it hangs over it. And I've talked to my cousin recently. He knows my story. And as the patients got younger and younger, it's made me now say, if I can help anyone, a child, someone on the way to college, someone being pressured because of a sport, a mother that is deciding maybe or whether or not to take a vaccine, if I could help just one of them, then my conscience is clear.
That was a very powerful set of statements he made at the time. And this is why I said I sensed he knew the importance of what he was saying, but he also understood the risk. But he felt he had to do something because he thought it was too significant to leave behind. When you see something like that, Richard, what are your thoughts?
I felt exactly the same way he did. In the beginning, when I started seeing these white fibrous clots on the previous clip that you played, I thought it was a strange anomaly. It was wild. It was weird. Sometimes you see some things that are off and you just kind of move on. But when I started seeing this over and over again, I started recognizing that something has changed in the blood itself. The blood is different. from the coffee grounds to the sandy blood, the dirty blood, the long stringy clots, the rubberiness, the white fibrous clots, all of it is something is wrong with the blood. And when I heard him speak about he noticed the change in the blood, that is what my concern was too. And I couldn't speak out in the very, very beginning when I first started seeing this, because I needed to build up some evidence and some of what it is that I'm saying. I wasn't willing to come out in the public and share something that I'm seeing if I didn't have anything to back it up. So it started off with images, and then in, sometime in the early summer, late spring, early summer of 2022, I started collecting actual samples, as some doctors like Dr. Ryan Cole was wanting to look at these under a microscope. So I started collecting samples and I started giving them to doctors, scientists, and researchers willing to try to look into this.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems that we have is, putting aside just for a moment the cause. Let's just take the elephant out of the room. The implications going forward, because based on those observations, Richard, with regards to the change in the blood, what it means, and the observations of the whistleblower, is that it may require, from a clinical point of view, in order to prevent clots, we have to be more aggressive with blood thinners. It may need a combination of antiplatelets with anticoagulants. And whilst there's a higher risk of bleeding, if we are seeing this kind of pattern where the blood itself seems to be far more amenable to clotting, it may change the parameters that we use clinically to manage to prevent clots. So meaning we use an INR, internationalized normalized ratio, but say between 2.5 to 3.5. We may find that we have to shift that up to 3 to 4, because we're trying to mitigate some of these patterns. So it has quite significant clinical relevance. And so we need to try and get to the bottom of it.
As we Dr. McMillan, yeah, you're absolutely you're right, Dr. McMillan. And it's hard to treat the problem correctly if people are not acknowledging that the problem exists. The whistleblower that I talked to, the cardiologist, endovascular specialist from Jacksonville, Florida, he describes the clots as devious clots. So when you were talking with your whistleblower about, is it common? Can you recognize the difference between these and what you've seen in the past? It's a stark difference. And like I said, my cardiologist calls them devious clots. One of the things that would disturb me is I asked him what usually happens to those clots when you do extract them out of living people. He says most of them are being thrown away. They are not being sent to pathology. So that's a destruction of evidence that's going on there. So again, how can you research an issue if you're not keeping the evidence of the clots and then being able to examine them in pathology? One of the other disturbing things is you asked your whistleblower, did he go to his administration and inform them that, hey, it looks like we got a problem here? And when I talked to my whistleblower, I got a communication back from him, eventually saying he has been instructed to terminate all further communication with me. So somebody higher up in his organization, I'm not sure, instructed him to basically stop communicating with me about this issue. And I haven't heard from him for the last several months. So it's a serious issue that's going on here. And there's a lot of silence going on, and going back to the BIE, for example, the British Institute of Embalmers, whether I send a survey to them or not, it's probably within their duty to go ahead and do their own survey and investigate what's happening, as embalmers within their organization have been identifying to them that they've been seeing these white fibrous clots. They have on their own website, if you go to the BIE website, you'll see they have a code of ethics. There's 5 key points they have on that code of ethics. And point number 4 is their duty to perform scientific research in problems that are affecting embalming. So as far as I'm concerned, by not taking the survey, by not doing their own investigation of what's happening here, they're violating their very code of ethics not to dig into this.
I think that's an excellent point, Tom. I think that was very, very well said. And as I said, it has a direct financial cost to the embalmers, because if it's taking you longer, if you have to do more procedures, it means you can do less of them. And so this is still relevant to their whole industry. So putting aside everything else, they should have the responsibility to try and look at what could be causing this and think about ways to mitigate it. Maybe they will increase the prices for embalming to compensate for the time that was being done. But it really should be taken into consideration. As we close out now, gentlemen, so I want to hear Richard's thoughts and then yours, Tom. What do you think, Richard, should be next steps, ideally in your mind?
Ideally, in my mind, would be acknowledgement of what it is that we're seeing and for them to investigate. However, I don't feel that that's going to happen anytime soon until the public awareness is to the point that it demands that they investigate this. I don't think they want it investigated because they're not wanting liability, because these organizations, government organizations, they all had one narrative in the beginning. And to acknowledge that the one narrative that they had happens to be caused, that it happens to be causing this issue, would put liability on their head, and they don't want that. And so I think they're doing what you said earlier on. They're hoping that this will just quietly go away. But we cannot continue to ignore it. We need to figure out why. We need to figure out testing, certain types of blood tests that might be able to be done for the people to find out, are they a high risk for developing these kind of clots? And if so, like you said, maybe we need to increase the amount or the way we attack blood thinners and different medications that can help mitigate the problem. The whole thing was to try to bring awareness, help the people, and hopefully we can find solutions. I'm not here to try to bash anyone. And if we find out that this has absolutely nothing to do with the elephant in the room or the virus itself, by God, we need to find out what is causing this, period.
Absolutely. Well said. And Tom?
Yeah, I'll just echo just what Richard's saying there. I make a plea to all the organizations I've been sending the survey to, because it's important information we're trying to gather. We're trying to gather information about timing, prevalence, and percentage of how big this phenomenon really is. It's important information to gather. Only the embalmers and the vascular surgeons and the people that work with bodies like on that capacity can really tell us what's happening. And if they stay silent about it, then we don't know what's happening. The world doesn't know. So, I make a plea to these people to please to let us know what they're seeing or not seeing, in their embalming rooms and in their cath labs.
Excellent. I think that, as I said, my role in this is to keep awareness on it. I do feel a responsibility. As I said, when the whistleblower came to me and he trusted me to speak about this, I felt that I had to make sure that this doesn't just disappear, because I do think it's important. I think it has clinical relevance. And so what we'll be doing next is that I am going to be reaching out to scientists who understand the blood clotting mechanism, people who have actually studied these clots, looking at exactly what is in them, to try and dissect what could be the mechanism. Because you're very right, Richard. Whatever the cause is, we need to understand this and try and figure out whether or not it is having direct impacts on people's health when they are alive. And as you said, if they are already there before someone has died, I can't imagine that it isn't very significant. And so there is a responsibility clinically as well to make sure that we get as many answers as we can. So the journey continues. The questions continue. They will not stop until we get answers. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I really appreciate you taking this time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll just ask you to hold on until after the outro.